Hi everyone. As we're approaching the holidays, I think it's important to talk about grief and some grief work. So, like anyone else, we've all experienced a loss in some ways, and it's important to identify different things. So, we have maybe some smaller losses, maybe we lost something, and then there's bigger losses, like we lost a friendship, a job, a relationship, maybe we lost a pet. We lose a lot of different things, and unfortunately, sometimes it just is hard to process and get through those things. Something to remember is there's the primary loss and there's secondary losses. So a primary loss is the loss of the friendship or the loss of a relative or the loss of a relationship, a job, a dog. And then the secondary loss is what you lose in connection to that. So if you lose a friend, you may lose a companion. You may lose your go-to person that you talk to about everything. If you lose a pet, you may lose your snuggle buddy that you snuggle with all the time, or just that reason why you went out for the walk and the reason why you enjoy looking at all the other animals that are around. If you lost a job, the primary loss is like a loss of income. Secondary loss could be the loss of the relationships you had with all your coworkers, the loss of that connectiveness with the company. There's like a lot of different layers to loss. So you don't just lose one thing, you lose more than one thing. And sometimes it could be super triggering. So when we're thinking about grief and loss in general, it's important to recognize, how do we process grief and what do we do to cope? So oftentimes I hear people go to substances, right? I need to have a drink. I can't believe this happened. Other people use maybe smoking, or maybe they try to distract themselves with a lot of different things. Maybe they bury themselves into work. So everybody processes grief differently. And so it's important to kind of recognize the way that you process grief and know what can you do about it and how can you help others through it. So just self-care, taking care of yourself, being gentle with yourself, understanding that there isn't necessarily a timeline of grief. It can hit you today and maybe you'll be fine for a couple months, and all of a sudden out of nowhere the wind blows and you're crying. So it's important to recognize there's no timeline with grief. Another important part is to make sure that you are expressing your feelings outwardly. Some people use artwork, some people use poetry, some people are just finding ways to get that out. If you have lost someone, it's important to recognize what they meant to you. How did that relationship feel when you were with them? And how do you want to remember them? So we're not going to remember them when they're sick or when they've passed, but remember them when they were living. What would they want you to be doing right now? How would you reflect their legacy outwardly so everybody knows how much of an amazing person they were? And how can you create something where their legacy can kind of live on? So oftentimes when the dates of the passing comes up, people get sad, they get kind of depressed, and I always tell them, let's focus on how can we celebrate that life that was so important. How can you celebrate a passing of someone? Maybe you can schedule a time out with family or friends, like being connected with other people and kind of going out and really celebrating their life. So grief work doesn't always have to be sad and kind of depressing and being in your room. It can also be something where it's like you're sharing that legacy and keeping that legacy alive. Something else to recognize too is, how can you support someone going through grief? You don't want to dismiss them. You really want to be open and listen. Oftentimes they don't need you to give advice. They just want you to hear them out. And sometimes when someone's dealing with grief, they don't know how to ask for help. So if you can look around at maybe some practical things that they may need, it's helpful to kind of get a little bit of that support. So if you're noticing that maybe they haven't taken a shower in a couple days, maybe kind of encouraging them, how can they, maybe you can run a bath for them so they can get in there, or how can you help them like navigate that? Maybe they haven't gone to the grocery store and you realize like, hey, about that time to go to grocery store and they really just are not having it. Maybe offering to go and pick up some things for them. So these are like just small things that are really, really helpful to kind of help them get by. Another thing is kind of offering them the support of, how can I get you out of this house? How can I get you kind of back moving again? But don't push them. Don't try to rush their timeline. Don't dismiss their feelings. Don't say, oh, it was just a dog. Oh, you'll find somebody else. I'm sure you'll get another job. because that's kind of not what they want to hear in that moment, but it's also insensitive because they need to process what they're feeling in that moment as well. I am working on hosting a webinar that is talking about grief and addiction. So if you are interested in learning more about that, I will have some more information on that soon, because I think it's really important and they are interconnected one way or the other. So I think it's really important to kind of talk about these things. And it's also going to be talking about and referring back to some grief workbooks that I have been working through with some clients. But also, I think it's important to note that there are some helpful and harmful phrases that often we hear when we are grieving, that it's important for us to know and be able to kind of help educate others on like what we should probably say and what we should avoid maybe. And it also talks about some grief that we don't talk about. So losses of babies and different issues that we may hold more internally. So now we're getting closer to the holidays. So let's think about how can we celebrate those that have passed on, that are no longer here, and how can we make sure their legacy is alive here for the holidays. Have a good night.